two desperate killers.
Evil, cunning, conniving.
An improbable escape.
Everyone is a little bit in awe of what they did.
$1 million a day manhunt.
Potential danger to the community could not have been higher.
And she was the key. She's the prison seamstress who shocked the country, helping to stitch together one of the most daring prison breaks of all time.
I'm not the monster that everybody thinks I am.
Tonight, Matt Lauer's exclusive interview with Joyce Mitchell.
I just got in over my head and I couldn't get out.
Why would a law-abiding wife and mother help two killers escape? Was she in love with one of them?
We all thought that they were, having sex back there.
There's a lot of things that go on behind prison bars.
What did she know? When did she know it? Why didn't she stop it?
Who could I tell? Who could I trust?
There's much more of this story you haven't heard.
There was a shotgun pointed right at me. Shawshank Redemption just pops in your head.
Joyce Mitchell in her first and only interview.
What have you lost in all this?
The Accomplice.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Dateline. I'm Matt Lauer. Every prison break is a big story, but this one had the whole country talking. Two desperate convicts, murderers, on the run after escaping with the help of a prison seamstress who may or may not have been in love with one of those killers. Tonight, you'll hear it all in our exclusive interview with the woman at the center of the story, a woman who claims that, in a way, she was a prisoner, too.
The massive manhunt for the two escaped murderers from Clinton.
An escape, the manhunt at a time seemed like a movie.
Have terrorized the people in this area and this.
How they got out, who is involved.
It was an inside job, we suspected, almost immediately. Somebody knew something.
No way possible that you could do it by yourself.
Somebody on the inside must have helped the two killers escape from the prison that was dubbed Shawshank, a feat no one had accomplished in living memory.
Unbelievable. Perfect execution. Wow.
And then the world was shocked to find out that somebody, the inside man of the sophisticated Houdini operation, was a middle-aged woman, a wife and mother with no criminal background.
For her to cross the line, it's absurd.
Her name, Joyce Mitchell.
I knew that they would blame me for all of it.
Until now, 51-year-old Joyce Mitchell has been the enigma at the heart of the story that drew headlines all around the world.
It started out as a flirtation.
The unlikely accomplice of two cold-blooded murderers whose escape launched a 1,000-strong manhunt and plunged terrified communities into a 3-week lockdown.
These are extraordinarily dangerous men.
Yes.
Who is she, and why did she do it?
You told a lot of lies.
I did.
Tonight, the inside story of the prison break. We'll reveal never-before-heard details about how they pulled it off. We'll take you inside the manhunt and deadly takedown. And in her first and only interview, you'll hear from the figure who became the linchpin of the conspiracy.
I'm not the monster that everybody thinks I am. I'm really not.
From within the rural serenity of upstate New York, where vacationers come to camp, fish, and hike, it rises unexpectedly, like a titanic gray fortress. With its high walls, armed sentries, and grim watchtowers, Clinton Correctional Facility radiates austerity, maximum security.
It was like a dungeon.
For most of its 3,000 prisoners, like Eric Jensen, entering Clinton Correctional Facility was like entering hell.
When you first go in there through the gates, you come through in the bus, and the gate shuts behind you, and you just look up and you can see like the walls surrounding you, and you feel helpless in there.
For officers like Jeffrey Dumas, working at Clinton Correctional was practically a fight.
Typically every day we had something to handle, whether it was just a fist fight, whether it was drugs being found, whether it was a stabbing, a slashing, gang violence, something like that typically always happened every day.
In 2008, it was into this forbidding world that Joyce Mitchell, a seamstress, entered to work in the prison tailor shop. And that's where we begin her story.
Thanks for doing this.
We met her recently at Clinton County Jail, where she's awaiting sentencing for her role in the prison break. She was shackled, handcuffed, and at times seemed nervous and emotional as she revealed how she was drawn into a brazen plot by two cunning and desperate murderers.
First of all, there's obviously an irony here in that you were someone who worked in a prison.
Yes.
And now you're being held behind bars. What's it been like so far?
It's nerve-wracking because it's not someplace that I would ever expect it to be.
Let's go to the beginning then, Mrs. Mitchell. Exactly what was your role in this prison?
I supervised one of the tailor shops. When the inmates came in, we taught them how to sew, and we made the clothing for the inmates.
As part of her training as a civilian worker, Joyce had been warned of the dangers of getting too close to the inmates. She had been shown instructional videos like this one, called Con Games Inmates Play.
Hey, you want me to take this over there while I'm at it?
No, that's confidential. You can't touch that.
It's just gonna be real quick, you know?
Were there rules set out by the prison, things you were allowed to do and things you weren't allowed to do in terms of forging a relationship with the prisoners?
You were supposed to, you know, be their supervisor, but I mean, me being a mother, I tend to, you know, respect people more than probably what some people think I should, especially when you're working in a prison.
And according to Joyce, the atmosphere in the tailor shop was casual. Guards routinely allowed chit-chat between civilians and inmates.
Nobody comes up and says, time's up.
You can talk 5 minutes, you can talk 10 minutes. It really doesn't matter.
So the conversations between you and some of the inmates went beyond teaching them how to make clothes. You talked to them about their lives.
Yes.
And their families.
Yes.
And the things they were interested in or not interested in.
Yes. I guess I was more relaxed around them, knowing a little bit about them.
She was nice. She wasn't strict like a lot of the other civilian employees in there.
Eric Jensen served 9 months at Clinton Correctional in 2011 and 2012 for violating parole after he was convicted of theft. He was one of the inmates Joyce supervised in that tailor shop.
She would actually come over and help you with whatever you needed help with, and she enjoyed being there.
Jensen wasn't the only inmate in the tailor shop to notice Joyce's good nature. 2 others, prison buddies, both convicted of murder, saw it too, but they saw it as a weakness to exploit. One was David Sweat.
Dave's crime was probably at the top of the hierarchy inside the prison system for most respectable crimes. He killed a law enforcement officer. It's a sick and twisted mentality in there.
The other was Richard Matt.
The word on Rick was that he liked to boil hot water with baby oil in it and throw it on people's faces. That's what the word about Rick was in Clinton.
Sweat and Matt were lifers with time on their hands, and it was in that tailor shop that they would hatch the prison break plot that would terrify upstate New York and transfix the nation. They would begin by working on Joyce, trying to turn her by turning on the charm.
I do think that she enjoyed the male attention. I think that she enjoyed coming to work and having, you know, people compliment her.
And soon Joyce Mitchell would find herself falling deeper and deeper into a plot from which she could find no escape. Throughout her years in the prison tailor shop, Joyce Mitchell got to know a lot of the inmates, but the 2 she ended up getting closest to were among the most notorious in the prison. They were both killers, and they would make Joyce their inside woman for a plan to escape. The first was David Sweat, a wiry, thoughtful prisoner in his early 30s.
What was your first impression of him?
He was very quiet, very respectful, never give you a problem when it came to doing what needed to be done.
But that impression hardly fit with the rest of his background.
David Sweat is a cold, calculating sociopath who only cares about himself.
As a 9-year-old growing up in New York, Sweat brought a butcher's knife to school to fend off bullies. He moved on to stealing cars and was put into a foster home after his mother couldn't cope with him. He also did time for burglaries. Then one night in 2002, he and 2 accomplices rammed a pickup truck into a Pennsylvania gun and fireworks store to steal weapons. Sheriff's Captain Kate Newcomb says her fellow officer, Deputy Kevin Tarsia, was on patrol in the wee hours and came upon the trio in a secluded parking lot.
He sees a suspicious vehicle. He pulls into the park to check it out. And he exits his patrol car.
It turned out Sweat and his crew were transferring stolen weapons into a car there. Tarsia went to investigate.
And as he walks around the front of the patrol car, he begins to take gunfire from David Sweat.
Sweat, clutching an assault rifle in one hand and a Glock pistol in the other, hit the officer with multiple shots.
He falls down to the ground, and then David Sweat gets into the car and proceeds to run Kevin over and drag him with the car.
One of Sweat's accomplices finished off the officer with shots to the head.
It was an assassination, absolutely. Purely for the uniform that he wore.
Just after 7 o'clock on the following morning, Kevin Tarsia's fiancée, Christiane Ciccone, heard a knock on her front door.
I opened the door and there were 3 police officers standing there. And I said, Kevin got hurt and he's in the hospital, but everything is going to be okay. And they said no. They said to me that Kevin was murdered.
The news was too hard to believe. She had been speaking to Kevin just hours earlier.
My whole life had been turned upside down. After Kevin had been murdered, life had changed completely. My dreams and everything was just torn away from me.
David Sweat was caught, eventually pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, and was sentenced to life without parole at Clinton. His best friend there was his cell neighbor, perhaps the most dangerous inmate inside Clinton Correctional Facility. His name was Richard Matt, a hefty man in his late 40s. He also worked in the tailor shop, where Joyce came to care about him, too.
When you started talking to Richard Matt, did you guys have anything in common?
Not really. No.
So your conversations consisted of, what can I learn about your family?
Yeah, pretty much. He was a very outgoing person.
Unlike the reserved, cautious David Sweat, Joyce says, without her even asking, Richard Matt bragged about the crimes he'd committed. They were even more savage than Sweat's.
The Richard Matt that I knew, manipulator, evil, cunning, conniving, psychotic. He beat loved ones, and he had no emotion towards anybody.
Like Sweat, Matt had been a troubled youth and grew up in foster homes near Buffalo, New York. He had a history of violence, graduating from juvenile facilities to prison. And at just 19, he made his first prison break. Lee Bates was just 20 in 1997 when he got to know Matt near Buffalo, occasionally driving him to local nightclubs. Bates says one day Matt, known locally as Rick, asked for a ride to see his former boss, 76-year-old food wholesaler William Rickerson. Matt said Rickerson owed him money.
Mr. Rickerson came and let us into the house. Rick had directed his voice at Mr. Rickerson. I'm here to get my money. Where's your money? And punched Mr. Rickerson in the face.
Matt and Bates tied Rickerson up with duct tape and bundled him into the trunk of Bates's car. For nearly 30 hours they drove around, Matt occasionally stopping to beat his boss some more, even breaking his fingers.
Mr. Rickerson had told Mr. Richard Matt, I'll take you to the money. Let me out of here, I'll take you to the money.
Bates says he protested when Matt poked a knife sharpener, like this one, into Rickerson's ear.
And it was at that point that Richard Matt had wanted to kill me. And he told Richard Matt, leave the kid out of this. It's between you and me. Richard Matt, in a more than a fit of rage, walked to Mr. Rickerson with the trunk open in my car and snapped his neck. I couldn't stop him.
But that wasn't the end of it. Matt used a hacksaw to cut up Rickerson's body and then dump the parts in the Niagara River.
We found 2 severed legs with no feet, 2 different sections of a torso.
Detective Glenn Gardner of North Tonawanda PD got the case. Lee Bates was soon arrested.
Lee Bates was the star witness that helped us eventually put the case together and also make an arrest warrant out for Richard Matt.
But while Bates served more than 16 years for his role in the murder, Richard Matt fled to Mexico before he could be arrested.
He's only there a short time, and he walks up behind a man in a bar. The man's in the men's room, and he stabs him in the back to get his money. They give him 20 years.
He served 10 years before being extradited to New York to stand trial for the Rickerson murder. Matt was considered so dangerous and such a flight risk that during his trial, a sniper was positioned near the courthouse. He was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. At Clinton, even inmates like Eric Jensen were wary of Matt.
Rick was known in there as somebody that you would want to watch your back. You know, you don't want to do him dirty and then think that he's not going to do anything about it.
The one man Matt seemed to trust was the cop killer David Sweat. He and Sweat were getting close to Joyce. But while Joyce believed it was a friendship, to the inmates it was an opportunity to crack open the door and try to escape. Joyce Mitchell had taken a few knocks in life. Born into a modest family in upstate New York, she dropped out of high school, worked at a local slipper factory, married her high school sweetheart, and soon divorced after her son Toby was born. By then she had caught the eye of a local man, Lyle Mitchell, who described the moment he saw Joyce take pity on a lonely child who wanted money for a toy.
She's very, very kind-hearted. She took the money out of her pocket and gave it to the kid. The lady has a heart of gold.
Joyce and Lyle married in 2001, and they both ended up as civilian workers at small-town Danamora's biggest employer, Clinton Correctional Facility.
We work together. We never leave the house unless we're together one another.
Joyce was with Lyle nearly all the time, so life settled into a predictable pattern, humdrum perhaps, and perhaps Joyce became restless. Joyce supervised some 30 men crammed into her tailor shop, which was not unlike any small industrial workshop. But as she showed them how to make prison clothes, says former inmate Eric Jensen, Joyce would ignore personal boundaries.
She was hands-on. She would get right in your personal space. She wouldn't even tell you, like, excuse me or anything like that. She would just, like, brush right past you. And that was one of the key things that I did pick up on her. She was overly friendly.
Joyce was particularly friendly with the cop killer, David Sweat.
Good worker?
Very good worker.
Sweat had been promoted to instructor, teaching inmates how to sew, which landed him the top prison wage, 40 cents an hour. The position also put him in a close professional relationship with Joyce. Then, she allowed their relationship to become personal. She says that was natural.
When you're working with your instructor, it's like your right-hand man. So, I mean, we were talking every day about work.
There was a friendship that had developed.
There was a friendship.
Was there flirtation as part of that friendship?
There was.
Jensen says the other inmates noticed that Joyce and Sweat spent a lot of time together alone, in a room where the fabric was stored.
Of course, they would be talking all day back and forth. You know, they laughed, they joked. We thought it was more than them just working together. They acted like they were friends from before Dave got incarcerated. Like they knew each other for a long time. They were very familiar with each other.
So familiar that rumors started flying.
We all thought that they were, having sex back there.
But it wasn't until September 2014, years after Joyce and Sweat first met, that prison authorities got wind of the gossip.
They were concerned that there was some statements that inmates Sweat and I either had in the past or were having at that time a relationship, which we were not. because they were saying a sexual relationship. We were not.
So there was no sexual contact between you and
No.
David Sweat?
There was never any sexual contact between us whatsoever.
But at the time there was suspicion that people brought to the attention of prison officials that there might be a sexual relationship between you and inmate Sweat. Were you warned? Did someone come to you and say, Joyce, look, you've maybe crossed a line. You got to get back on the other side of the line?
Actually, nobody ever really said too much.
Were you worried that you were going to lose your job at that point?
No, because there wasn't anything between us.
I was very shocked to learn that she allegedly had sexual relations with an inmate.
Jeffrey Dumas, a former Clinton sergeant with 22 years of service, knows the prison inside and out and knew inmate Sweat and Joyce Mitchell well.
I knew, okay, this is not true at that level. There is no way in that facility with the officer in the shop and the way it's constructed that they could have done something like that.
Still, Joyce says she knew salacious innuendo was in the air, and she had to try to nip it in the bud.
I was the one that, when they made the assumption, I went to the superiors, I guess if that's what you want to call them, and I made the complaint that they were saying stuff that was untrue.
You thought your reputation was being sullied?
Yes. And they came, they investigated it, and they found nothing.
Yet that episode didn't seem to deter Joyce from becoming close with another murderer, Sweat's buddy, Richard Matt.
How long did it take, Mrs. Mitchell, for you to consider him to be a friend, as opposed to just another inmate?
It took a little while, but he was in different shops with me too. You know, he always had said, you know, you don't ever have to worry. If something happens, no one will ever hurt you. You know, we'll make sure that you're safe.
What did you think he meant by that? Explain that for me within the context of life in a prison.
You've heard stories where inmates will take civilians hostage or whatever. He always would say, I never had anything to worry about. He would make sure that I was safe.
Did you take that to mean that he personally would, or that he also had connections within the prison where he could protect you in other areas as well?
I took it at first personally.
That he would protect you?
Yeah, he would protect me personally.
Did an alarm go off in your body at that moment? Was there some internal alert that said, Joyce, this is a slippery slope?
Yes, there was.
And did anybody ever stop you as you were having some of these conversations with the inmates and say, you know, Joyce, back off a little bit, get back behind the desk, treat them like inmates, stop being such a nice person, stop being friends with them?
They never actually told me to stop, but they did say, you know, you're too friendly, you know, you're too nice.
And when they would say that to you, would you stop? Would you change?
I would a little bit, and then the inmates were wondering, you know, what happened. And at the time that everything happened, I was going through a time where I didn't feel like my husband loved me anymore. And I guess it was just me. I was going through depression. And I guess they saw my weakness. And that's how it all started.
So you were looking for something. You were looking for attention.
Yes.
Their attention made you feel good?
Yes, their attention made me feel good.
And it didn't seem to matter that her husband Lyle worked close by, also as a supervisor in one of the prison's other tailor shops.
So you would see him during the day?
Yes.
And he knew David Sweat and Richard Matt as well?
Yes.
In some odd way, you were getting from these prisoners, in terms of a relationship, what you didn't feel you were getting from your husband at home?
Yes.
And that spelled trouble. David Sweat and Richard Matt now had their hooks into Joyce, and they were gently reeling her in. They had a dream of escaping the prison, and they were working on a plan to make it happen. All they needed was an accomplice on the inside, and Joyce was it. It was time to put her to work. For lifers David Sweat and Richard Matt, the Clinton Correctional Facility was not only home, it had become a comfortable one. Part of the reason is that they lived close to each other in the prison's coziest neighborhood, the Honor Block.
The liberties that they were given was definitely a detriment to the security.
Many prisons have honor blocks. At Clinton, inmates like Sweat and Matt had more rec time. There were fewer guard checks and a lot of noise, says Jeffrey Dumas.
There's TVs going, movies, sports, cards, dominoes. You know, they're either arguing or they're laughing. Matt and Sweat could have laid in their cell, sawed away at their wall, and nobody would have ever heard a thing.
And in fact, that's exactly what Sweat and Matt began planning to do, to break through their cell walls to freedom. But first, they'd need some tools, and that meant getting illicit items into Clinton. That was no big deal, says Eric Jensen.
Every day this happens, every day. Whether it be a television, a radio, a Walkman, a bag of food, clothing, everything is moving back and forth in there. It's like a small city.
All they needed was someone who moved outside the prison to bring things inside. And that's where their friend Joyce Mitchell would come in. The trigger to involve Joyce directly in their plot began, oddly enough, when Sweat was abruptly removed from the tailor shop in September 2014.
He was actually taken out of the shop because he had made a comment to my supervisor about another civilian, and my supervisor wrote him up for that.
That meant Sweat was reassigned, and he lost the prison wage that bought him favors and relative comfort on the inside.
When Mr. Sweat was removed from the shop, I guess I felt bad because even though he's an inmate, just like you or I, you know, if we lost our jobs, we'd want someone to help us.
As Joyce took pity on Sweat, Jeffrey Dumas says that was the perfect moment for Richard Matt to step in.
Then inmate Matt sees his opportunity to be the go-between between her and Sweat, because Matt and Sweat lived in the same block. So whatever type of friendship that she had with Sweat, Matt took the opportunity to prey on her.
Matt decided to test her by tugging on her heartstrings.
Mr. Matt would ask me to bring stuff in for Mr. Sweat so that he would have food or something.
Astonishingly, Joyce responded and agreed. She says she found herself at home baking tasty treats and brought them to the prison for Sweat.
Does that break prison rules?
It actually does.
So what did you bring him?
Cookies, brownies, you know, stuff like that.
Pretending that you were bringing them in for yourself?
Yes.
Did you ever tell your husband that you were doing any of this?
He didn't know a lot of what I was doing. No.
Why? You're smiling about that. Why?
No, I'm not really smiling. I'm just, I didn't want him to be in trouble. And if I got caught, okay, then I'm the one in trouble. But I didn't want my husband to be in trouble also.
And he never saw you leaving in the morning with a bunch of brownies or cookies and said, why are you taking those to work?
No, because I would make his lunch just like I would make my own.
And she simply took the cookies and brownies with her lunch to the tailor shop.
How often did you do that, Joyce?
I did it a lot.
Were you ever nervous? Were you afraid you'd get caught doing it?
I actually was. Because they're supposed to check our bags every morning when we come in. And they're supposed to check them when you go out. But they never did.
And then how would you get them to Mr. Sweat?
Mr. Matt would take them.
She says along with the cookies, she passed racy notes and photos to Sweat, using Matt as a go-between. So Matt upped the ante. He next asked for a pair of sparring gloves. Joyce delivered again, and also slipped him some treats of his own.
I did get some salts, like seasoned salts and stuff like that, and he would trade it with the other inmates for different foods to give to Mr. Sweat.
Kind of prison currency.
Yeah.
And because she could apparently get through prison security unchecked, the prison door became a revolving door. In addition to the affection she received, Joyce traded the baked treats for, of all things, artwork.
It's widely known that Richard Matt was a talented artist.
Yes.
Sounds strange for a guy with his criminal record.
Yes.
Matt painted portraits of celebrities: Marilyn Monroe, Julia Roberts, Bill and Hillary Clinton, President Obama, and others.
When you were doing favors for him, was he repaying you with artwork?
I did get 2 paintings from him. One was of my son and one was of our dogs.
But to get Richard Matt's artwork out of prison, Joyce needed help. She says she relied on a 27-year veteran of the prison service, Officer Gene Palmer, a so-called snitch officer who had extensive dealings with Matt and Sweat.
Inmate Matt and inmate Sweat were both snitches, and they would tell Officer Palmer who's doing what.
You tell him who the gang leaders are, who the gang members are, who has the weapons.
And in exchange for that information, Palmer did favors, like getting Matt's artwork out of the prison.
So when those 2 paintings ended up in your home, did Lyle see them, and did he say, how did these end up in your possession? What kind of relationship do you have with Richard Matt?
He didn't really question it. He didn't know that they were even coming in until after the fact.
He didn't send up a red flag and say, wait a minute, if you're getting paintings from him, this could be trouble for you and for us.
He did afterwards tell me, you shouldn't be getting them. But I'm a redhead and I tend to be stubborn at some things.
These things that go on inside the walls of a prison, a maximum security prison, shock a lot of people. And I think a lot of people ask the question, didn't somebody in an official capacity have to know this stuff was going on? Do you think people within the prison turned a blind eye to things like this?
I can't speculate on what they were doing, what they were thinking. Anything's possible, I guess.
Anything was possible, it seemed. If Joyce could get cookies and sparring gloves into the prison and paintings out, no questions asked, what couldn't she bring in? In early 2015, Richard Matt decided to find out. He asked Joyce to bring him something much more serious than cookies and brownies.
And so at this point, you have to realize you're getting yourself in a really bad situation.
Yes.
Joyce Mitchell was getting in deep. For months, she had been doing illicit favors for her friend, cop killer David Sweat, with Richard Matt as the go-between. But now, with Sweat no longer in the tailor shop, Matt moved in.
He looked at me one day and said, Joyce, I do love you. And I said, I love my husband. And I walked away.
Speculation has run rampant, Joyce, that there was something more here, that while Mr. Matt told you he loved you, that by this point you loved him as well.
No. It started out as a flirtation thing, but that's all it ever was. There was never any love between myself and Mr. Matt.
At some point, there was sexual contact between you and Richard Matt. And when I interviewed your husband, Lyle, he said you swore to him that there was not. And that wasn't true, was it?
There was never any actual sexual intercourse. Mr. Matt had grabbed me a couple times and kissed me. And then there was one point where he had he wanted me to perform oral sex on him. And I said no. And when I said no, he grabbed my head and
pushed me down.
She says what happened next was very brief, and as soon as she could, she jumped up and ran away.
So when you told your husband there was no sexual contact, you were talking about intercourse and you were talking about consensual sexual contact.
Yes.
So just to be clear, at no point in this relationship with Richard Matt was there any, in your opinion, consensual sexual contact between the two of you?
There was never any consensual.
When we hear of things that were going on in this tailor shop and even the forced sexual contact between you and Mr. Matt, my question is, did anybody see this? This is a prison. Aren't there cameras? Doesn't anybody know this type of thing is going on?
No, they don't.
Joy says Matt began forcing himself on her in other ways too. While she'd been taking baked goods to Sweat in prison and sparring gloves to Matt, in early 2015, the wish list suddenly changed.
They wanted a star-shaped bit.
Drill bit.
Yeah, Mr. Matt asked me for it, but it was for Mr. Sweat.
Okay, but when Richard Matt comes to you and says, Joyce, I need a star-shaped drill bit, that's a lot different than cookies and brownies.
Yeah.
And what did you think?
At first, I'm like, I can't get you that. But then he's like, I need it. Sweat needs it.
For what?
At first, they didn't tell me.
What it sounds like here is that once you made the mistake of crossing a line, Mr. Matt used your transgressions as a way to get you in deeper and deeper and deeper.
Yes.
And when Joyce didn't consent, she says the demands were backed up by threats.
Was he threatening you? Was he saying, get me the next thing, and if you don't get me the next thing, I'll tell people that you got me the first few things, and you lose your job?
No. No, it was always just he was going to hurt Lyle. It was never he was going to tell anybody anything.
She says she feared Matt knew enough about her and her family to make good on his threat to hurt her husband.
I was just so scared. Mr. Matt has a lot of power. A lot of power. He could get whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted.
You even felt outside of prison that he could have caused harm to Lyle and your family outside the walls of that prison?
Yes.
In the face of the threats to her husband, Joyce says fear took over, so she continued to bring Matt what he wanted, even when he asked for hacksaw blades. But smuggling those into a maximum security prison was a far different proposition than sneaking in baked goods. So after she bought the blades at Walmart, Joyce improvised and hid them in hamburger meat. She put the meat in her bag and, as usual, clocked in at the prison.
So you walked right in the prison, nobody checked your bag.
Nobody checked.
In it you had hacksaw blades.
Yes.
Once in the prison, she put the meat in a freezer.
That's when the officer come and took it.
And that officer was?
Mr. Palmer.
Gene Palmer.
Yes.
The same Gene Palmer who Joyce said helped her smuggle 2 paintings out of the prison.
So obviously some arrangement had been made between Richard Matt and Gene Palmer, and some arrangement obviously was made between you and Mr. Matt. You're getting the hacksawed blade, you're putting it in the frozen beef.
Yes.
You're transferring the frozen beef to Mr. Palmer, and Mr. Palmer is getting it to Mr. Matt.
Yes.
You're in deep trouble at this point.
Yes, I am. I am in.
And so's
deep,
Mr. Palmer.
Well, I don't know if Mr. Palmer actually knew if they were in there or not. All I know is Mr. Matt came in and said, Palmer's going to come and get the hamburger. But whether Mr. Palmer actually knew, I have no idea.
Joyce, who says she was being threatened by Richard Matt and lived under a cloud of intense fear, didn't breathe a word of what was happening to anyone.
I've never been in prison, but I will tell you, if I were you, I think I would have said, I'm going to go home, I'm going to get my husband, I'm going to get him in a car, and we're going to go to the police, and I'm going to tell the police, with my husband next to me, so I know nobody can harm him, exactly what's going on here.
I should have done that, but I was too scared because Mr. Matt even asked where my mother lived, where my son lived. He could have beat me, he could have done whatever he wanted to me, but I wasn't going to let him hurt my husband or my family.
Whatever the truth, Joyce continued to help the two killers. If she wasn't already in enough hot water, she was about to go all in. Sweat and Matt were going to tell her exactly what they were doing, making her the third conspirator in a rapidly evolving plan. And we're back now with more of our exclusive interview with Joyce Mitchell, the woman who helped two convicted killers escape in one of the boldest prison breaks of all time. The big question, of course, is why? Why would a law-abiding wife and mother do something like that? Especially after she says she learned what they had in mind for her husband. In the spring of 2015, convicted killers David Sweat and Richard Matt were ready to set their escape plan in motion. And thanks to Joyce Mitchell, they now had the tools to make it happen. Tools she continued to sneak into prison for them.
I give them the start bit. I give them 4 full-size hack blades, but having to put them in the Hamburg, they had been broken in 2, so they actually had like 8 pieces of hacksaw blades. And I give them chisel and punch. That's all that I give them.
That's a lot.
It is.
So by this time, you've delivered him a star-shaped drill bit, hacksaw blades, and you know why they're using these things.
Yes.
What they're using them for.
Yes.
And you didn't go to anyone, even though he's threatening you, according to you.
Who could I tell? Who could I trust?
Joyce says she feared that if she reported what was going on, Richard Matt would find out. She says she couldn't even confide in Gene Palmer, the officer who had taken Richard Matt's artwork out of the prison for her.
Do you believe that Gene Palmer also knew that these 2 inmates were planning to escape?
I have no idea.
So at no point of transferring goods between the 2 of you, the frozen meat, did you ever look at each other and acknowledge what was going on, and you never said to him, you know about this as well?
No, I never did.
Like it or not, Joyce had become a co-conspirator in a plot to help 2 vicious murderers escape from prison. And Matt now spilled details of that plot to her.
So you'd go in during the day, and you'd see at least Mr. Matt in the tailor shop.
Yes.
And he would say to you, hey, we've breached the wall of our cell, we got out of the wall. He would let you know this?
Yes.
Working late at night, Matt and Sweat used the hacksaw blades to saw through the 1/4-inch thick steel walls of their cells. Once through their walls, they discovered this maze of catwalks. Now, each night, they went exploring here, looking for a path to the ground floor and a way outside the prison walls.
Wasn't it also astonishing to you that they were actually getting out of their cells at night?
Yes. They were waiting till after, I think it's the 11 o'clock bed check, and then they would go.
You know, I'm trying to put myself in the position of someone watching this at home, and they're all saying, and you know what they're saying, she's hearing these stories every day. She's given them some of the tools they're using.
And she's the monster.
And she did nothing to stop it. In some ways, it almost sounds like you were fascinated by the danger of all this. It also sounds like there was more to this relationship.
No, it was just an infatuation. That's all it was.
Matt and Sweat were well aware of Joyce's infatuation, and they made sure to keep her close. One day, they told her that they made an important discovery.
They had found a toolbox, and Mr. Sweat picked the lock, and they found power tools in it.
They found that toolbox in the crawl space area behind the walls of their cell. And what was your reaction when you were hearing these stories?
I was trying to figure out how a toolbox got left. They were really excited that they found power tools.
The escape plan was coming together, so Richard Matt finally told Joyce what he expected her to do. On the night of the escape at 12 midnight, when small-town Dannemora was sleeping, Joyce was to get into her Jeep and drive to an intersection about 130 yards from the prison wall.
I was supposed to pretend that I was making a phone call while they were coming out.
Sitting in your Jeep?
Yes.
What were you supposed to bring with you other than the car?
Clothes for them. I was supposed to bring a tent. I was supposed to bring a shotgun.
Did you have a shotgun?
We do own a shotgun.
And then the plan, let's make sure we understand this completely, was to get them changed, get them in the car.
Yes.
If all went according to plan and they pulled off the great escape, they'd be far away before law enforcement had a chance to get a fix on them. And there was something else. Once they were free, starting new lives, Matt said that Joyce and David Sweat would live together.
I'm very confused.
Yes.
Richard Matt's the one who tells you he loves you.
Right.
He's the one that you've been dealing with on a regular basis because
Right.
he's the one in the tailor shop.
Yes.
He's the one you had the sexual contact with.
Yes.
And yet he is now saying that when we get out of here, it's going to be you and David Sweat together?
Well, he was making Mr. Sweat believe that.
Joyce says she was just pretending to go along with the plan out of fear for her husband. She says the inmates believed he was the one person who could derail their escape.
They called your husband
the glitch.
The glitch, meaning he was the glitch in the plan.
Yes.
And he had to be disposed of.
Yes.
As the days grew longer and spring filled the air, Joyce Mitchell says David Sweat's and Richard Matt's dream of escape, with Joyce herself as the getaway driver, was becoming more real.
I was told I was going to go live a happy life with him.
The only fly in the ointment, she says they told her, was her partner of 21 years, Lyle.
Mr. Matt said he was going to kill my husband.
They want to kill your husband.
Yes.
In fact, Joyce says Matt had figured out how to carry out the killing once the two inmates made it out. She says he wanted to push Lyle off a high rock face and needed Joyce's help.
He wanted me to find a cliff to put my husband over, and I'm like, I'm not doing that.
In the car, push him?
In the truck.
Joyce says she refused, so Matt came up with a new plan.
Mr. Matt wanted me to give my husband some pills to knock him out.
Then Joyce says once the prisoners got into her Jeep on the night of the escape, the first stop would be her home.
You would have drugged Lyle, the glitch.
Yes.
He would have been passed out at home.
Yes.
And what did they say they were going to do?
Matt said that he was going to kill Lyle.
See, this is confusing because on the one hand, you're telling me they wanted your help to get out of prison. On the other hand, you're telling me that after he got out of prison, he was threatening to kill your husband. But with one phone call, you could have prevented him from getting out of prison.
I know. But I was so scared. Matt had other inmates watching myself and my husband through all of this. They knew where I went, when I went, and who I was talking to.
How many times did you want to tell Lyle what was going on?
There were a lot of times I wanted to just sit down and tell him what was going on. But I knew that if I did, he would, you know, he'd go in and confront them. And it would have been just like Mr. Matt to do something to him right in the prison. And I couldn't let that happen.
You were literally afraid that at some point during a day in the prison, Richard Matt would harm your husband Lyle or have someone else harm him for him.
Yes.
And you thought he was capable of that.
No, he's capable of it. There's no thought about it. He would have been capable.
So when Matt gave her the pills, she put on an act.
Now I knew I was in way over my head. So I just started playing along and letting them believe that that's what was going to happen.
You keep saying, you know, I love my husband. I couldn't let this happen to my husband. And it's hard to believe.
I know it's hard to believe, but I do love my husband. And I've always loved my husband. I was going through a point in my life. A lot of people go through depression. A lot of people go through that. And I just got in over my head and I couldn't get out. And I couldn't tell anybody. I couldn't tell my husband. Couldn't tell my family. I couldn't tell my coworkers. I couldn't tell anybody. There's nobody you can tell.
He had complete control of you, in your opinion,
Yes.
at that point.
Yes.
While Joyce continued to do what she was told, Matt and Sweat were still trying to find a way through the thick prison walls. In early May, they got a stroke of good luck. The prison heating system was shut off for summer, so they sought an entrance into a steam pipe and climbed in. They later crawled until they were beyond the prison walls and sawed another hole, exiting into a tunnel under the street. Now, the only thing standing between them and freedom was a manhole cover, 130 yards from the prison wall. All that was left was to pick a night for the actual escape.
Let me play devil's advocate at this moment. When you now hear they are going to escape, as a matter of fact,
Yes.
they want to kill your husband.
Yes.
At that point, the worst that can happen to you is you're going to lose your job if you go to the authorities and probably get charged with contraband
Yes.
charges. That's the time to go to authorities again, isn't it? Here's another time
Like I
where you
said,
could have stopped this.
I was just so scared.
Whatever Joyce might have done to stop the escape, Sweat and Matt had reached the point of no return. On June 5th, Joyce was in the tailor shop when Richard Matt approached.
He just happened to come in one day and said, "Tonight's the night."
And what's the last thing you said to him?
I kind of stayed away from him the rest of the day.
You didn't say, "I'll see you tonight"?
No, because at the end of the day, as he was going out the door, he raised his hand as a motion of, like, "I'll see you tonight." And I just ignored him.
After her shift, trying to pretend that nothing was out of the ordinary, Joyce left the prison with her husband Lyle and went for dinner.
I didn't see anything different. Absolutely
Nothing.
Nothing. Absolutely nothing. I didn't.
She wasn't particularly nervous?
Nothing.
Fidgety, agitated, upset?
We stopped for supper that night on the way home for Chinese food, and she ate like she normally does.
So as Lyle and Joyce dined that evening, Joyce gave no sign that she was the linchpin of an extraordinary plot, and that the man she was with, who helped raise her son, was the target of a planned hit to be carried out later that night. As the clock ticked toward midnight, Joyce was fully aware that David Sweat and Richard Matt were leaving their cells, sneaking to that manhole cover, and heading for freedom. The prison break was on.
Dangerous and on the run. A manhunt is underway right now.
More than 440 corrections and law enforcement officers are
The
now
truth is, these guys could be just about anywhere.
It had taken months of meticulous planning, a well-spun web of lies and deceit, artful prison engineering, and the shrewd nurturing and manipulation of Joyce Mitchell by two master criminals. And on the morning of June 6th, they had pulled it off.
Authorities are now searching in the U.S., Canada, and Mexico.
As the first reports came in about a dramatic escape from Clinton Correctional Facility that Saturday, Clinton County Sheriff David Favreau headed toward the prison.
I had received a phone call from my patrol chief that morning, and I was advised that 2 inmates were unaccounted for at Dannemora Correctional Facility. I didn't believe it. I thought at first he was joking.
No one had escaped from that prison in living memory. The sheriff knew it was a crisis.
I started to gear up, get my vest, my weapons, get into my truck and start heading up towards the Dannemora area to see if I could be of some assistance. Within a matter of 30 minutes after that, I got another call back saying that they were out in the public. That's when I knew it was a lot more serious.
Do you instantly hear what these 2 guys were in prison for in the first place?
I knew that one of them was a cop killer. You knew that there was a serious danger to the public.
As Sheriff Favreau was getting more details and law enforcement agencies mobilized, NBC News correspondent Stephanie Gosk arrived in Dannemora to cover the story.
And your first thought is, how did anyone break out of there?
When law enforcement poured into the search area, it became hard to simply move around.
This wasn't just a couple of cops walking down the street knocking on doors. This was hundreds of law enforcement on the streets, holding positions with automatic weapons, helicopters overhead. Everything was extremely difficult. There were roadblocks every half a mile. You would be stopped. You'd have to open up your trunk.
Just a short distance away from the prison, the escapees' would-be getaway driver, Joyce Mitchell, was just waking up. But she was nowhere near David Sweat and Richard Matt. Instead, she was in a hospital room, coming to under a cloud of doom.
What happened?
I knew that was the night it was going to happen. and I didn't really know what to do.
Joyce says at the moment of truth, she had been overcome by confusion and fear. And instead of driving to the rendezvous location at midnight with a shotgun and supplies, she told her husband Lyle she had chest pains and needed help. So when Sweat and Matt slid back that manhole cover and poked their heads up into the street, Joyce was nowhere to be seen.
I was so scared. And I ended up having a panic attack, and my husband did take me to the hospital.
Now it was morning, and as she lay in her hospital bed, glued to the television news, Joyce realized Sweat's and Matt's brazen escape plan had been a success after all.
When you heard that they had escaped and broken out and you knew you weren't there to pick them up the way you had promised, what was your first reaction?
I was scared to death. I didn't know if they would come looking for my husband and do something to him. So I didn't let my husband out of my sight.
Did you start to think, Mrs. Mitchell, that I have just helped two guys get out of prison? One guy murdered a man and cut his body into pieces. The other guy shot a sheriff's deputy. What is the chance, or what is the likelihood they're going to kill some innocent person now that they've escaped from prison?
I was scared, very scared that it would happen. And I prayed and prayed and prayed that they would get caught and no one would get hurt.
Didn't you also pray and pray and pray that they would get killed so that they couldn't tell the story of what had happened?
No.
You didn't think that if they got caught, they were going to tell everything you did?
I knew they would. And I knew that they would blame me for everything.
So this idea, though, that if you had shown up with that Jeep and been their getaway driver, that the three of you were going to go off and live some different kind of life, kind of a, some kind of a Bonnie and Clyde threesome, that's something you never actually considered doing?
No.
You weren't in love with one of them or both of them, and you were going to go off and forge a different life for yourself?
No, I wasn't.
You know, it's funny because if you don't show up, you're caught anyway.
Yes.
Any doubt in your mind, Joyce, that if you had shown up in that Jeep that night, is there any doubt in your mind that they would have killed you as soon as you handed them that shotgun?
They would have. Because they would have had the vehicle. They wouldn't have needed me.
That would have been the moment their relationship with you ended.
Yes.
As she processed all these dark thoughts in the hospital, she switched on her cell phone, and it exploded to life.
I had tons of messages, and one was from my son that state police were looking for me.
The police had discovered Joyce and her husband Lyle both knew Sweat and Matt well. So the couple left the hospital and went to the police station to be questioned. And Joyce had a decision to make. Was it finally time to tell the truth? As law enforcement hunted down the escapees, David Sweat and Richard Matt, Joyce Mitchell was called in with her husband Lyle to the police station to face investigators. They wanted to know why she hadn't shown up for work that Saturday, and they had other questions too.
Joyce Mitchell was identified relatively early as somebody that had contact with both Matt and Sweat.
Authorities were certain Matt and Sweat had helped carrying out their elaborate plan, and Joyce was their #1 suspect. She knew both inmates, and there were those unfounded rumors of a sexual relationship between her and Sweat. But when Joyce was questioned by law enforcement, says Clinton County District Attorney Andrew Wiley, it did not seem she was being completely honest.
She was providing truthful information, but she wasn't providing everything.
Joyce admits that now.
I was not completely honest with the state police at
What'd you lie
first.
about?
About knowing that they had gotten out and the other parts of the story.
But investigators made a startling discovery. The phone number for Richard Matt's daughter was in Joyce's cell phone. When they pressed her about it, Joyce was forced to tell them that she'd been in touch with Matt's daughter as a favor. It was a red flag for police and news to Lyle.
So let me make sure I understand this. So your wife had Matt's daughter's cell phone number?
Yes.
On her cell phone?
Yes.
So it was clear that she had contacted
Yes.
the daughter of this escaped murderer.
Yes.
Joyce was released after a few hours, but she had further aroused investigators' suspicions.
The truth doesn't always come out right away. It may take an hour, it may take 10 hours, it may take over a course of a couple days or a week to actually get the truth out.
Meanwhile, new information about the prison break was pouring in.
It was an elaborate plot,
giving the DA details of how the escape actually happened.
It's amazing how it occurred.
The scenario investigators were uncovering went something like this. On the night of the escape, Matt and Sweat left dummies made from paper mache and clothing to make it look like they were still in their cell beds. Then they slipped through the sawed-out holes in their cells, down through the maze of catwalks, and proceeded along their planned escape route, through the steam pipe, and out through the manhole, just 130 yards from the prison. A final poke in the eye to authorities was this taunting, racist note stuck on the steam pipe.
It's kind of like a shock and awe at the time. Shawshank Redemption just pops in your head.
Your first thought is, how did they ever even think they could do it?
NBC News correspondent Stephanie Gosk was as amazed as everyone else.
The pure hubris of concocting the idea and executing it. Everyone is a little bit just sort of in awe of what they did.
The day after the escape, Joyce was called in for another round of questioning by police. This time they asked about the sparring gloves she had given Richard Matt.
She was in there, I would say, half, 3/4 of an hour. And the investigator came out and said, "Mr. Mitchell, your wife has more involved than what she's letting on." What?
As the investigators' questions piled up, the pressure finally started getting to Joyce.
And I talked to the investigators, and I tried to tell them everything I could. And they told me, "You help us, we'll help you."
And that's when she finally came clean about all of it. The hacksaw blades smuggled in hamburger meat, the other tools she gave the inmates, and that she knew for weeks, if not months, that Matt and Sweat were preparing to escape, but that she never told a soul. The DA was stunned.
It's kind of hard to, even comprehend.
It didn't take long for the news to get out that Joyce was involved.
Joyce Mitchell, she works in the prison. She's being called a person of interest, being questioned by police.
When the details of it started to come out and we learned a little bit more of Joyce Mitchell's involvement, then you realized how calculating they were. She's been married for decades, she has a son, she's a grandmother. And they convinced her that this would be the best thing for her to do in that moment, to help them escape from this prison and run away with them. That's pretty remarkable.
Joyce's family was in a state of disbelief. Her own son Toby staunchly defended his mom.
She's not the kind of person that's going to risk her life or other people's lives to let these guys escape from prison.
What was it like for you when your wife's name, and your name as a result, were splashed all over the headlines the next day?
It was just total shock. I was just in disbelief. And I said, "How can you do this?" She said, "It just got out of hand." I said, "Then I was scared and I didn't know what to do."
But Joyce hadn't told him the worst of it.
He said, "I got something else to tell you. They want to kill you." I said, "What?"
According to your wife, they were going to kill you for what reason?
Did that get me out of the way? But she said she was never going through with it. That's what she told me. That she really loved me and she was in too deep.
Though Joyce says she told the truth, the DA wasn't buying all of it.
She could have advised many people on many occasions what was happening. I think she was making excuses. She was trying to make people feel sorry for her. It didn't work with this prosecutor.
As days passed with no sign of Matt or Sweat, local officials joined forces with law enforcement agencies from all over the country.
Our plan is to pursue these men relentlessly.
New York State Police Commander Major Charles Guess led the hunt.
The potential danger to the community could not have been higher with these two individuals. Desperate escapees who were already incarcerated for life and convicted murderers. We believed that they would immediately attempt to arm themselves and would literally stop at nothing to evade law enforcement and complete their escape plan.
The state police had already been joined by FBI, Border Patrol, and corrections officers numbering some 1,500 strong, on foot, in vehicles, and in the air. They unleashed canine units and used high-tech infrared sensors in an effort that cost $1 million a day. But even as local residents called in thousands of leads, none panned out.
My sense is that they had no idea where these guys were. And they would say in one breath, well, they could be in Mexico or in northern Canada or in your backyard. They just didn't know.
So the manhunt searched farther afield, extending into dense, rugged forest terrain. And the officers encountered monsoon conditions.
We had rain either every day or just about every day. Literally, it's no exaggeration, you can't see 3 to 5 feet in front of your face in the daylight, let alone at night.
And as the search expanded, fear took over.
That's why I have a Glock 40 caliber.
I'm pretty well off. I've got a gun on me. I've lived in Redford for almost 20 years, so it's scary.
They're killers. No one really knew if they had gotten guns, if anyone else was helping them, how far they had gotten. And there was real fear.
More time went by. Search teams marched on. Everyone hoped for a break, especially Joyce, now a prisoner in her own home, afraid to face her neighbors.
Were you glued to the set? Were you watching this like everybody else in the rest of the country was watching it?
Yes, I was. I was praying every day that they would catch them.
Wasn't it surreal?
It was.
To know that you would help them get out and you're sitting home watching the coverage of this?
Yes.
But suddenly, for Joyce, it was time to face the music. A week after she was supposed to be waiting at that manhole cover for Sweat and Matt, she was arrested and charged with promoting contraband and criminal facilitation. Soon after Joyce was taken off to jail, the hunt for the killers was about to heat up.